Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Dan Levin, and I'm so grateful for you joining us at Temple Bethel tonight for an exploration of the mystical meanings that we can find in the celebration of Hanukkah and celebration of the Festival of Lights. We had a little bit of a technical glitch today, so unfortunately, we don't have everyone joining us by Zoom in addition to our live stream. So I hope that you are enjoying us from wherever you are, through YouTube and through our Boxcast, through our live stream. And we are going to have a wonderful evening tonight where we have a chance to look at a different side of the celebration of the Festival of Lights, one that's not so much connected to the gift giving and commercial side of our celebration of Hanukkah, but one that invites us to go a little bit deeper and to explore the deeper and larger spiritual meanings and significance to our celebration of this festival. In the Jewish calendar, there are three major festivals. And those are the celebrations of Sukkot and Pesach and Shavuot. Those are the three major festivals that are delineated in the Torah, that are the ancient, what are called the Shalosh Regalim, the three festivals that required your raglayim, your legs, to make pilgrimage, or Chag, right? The word Hajj in Arabic is the same word as the word Chag in Hebrew, which means festival, but it meant a pilgrimage festival, a festival where you would journey to a sacred site, such as the temple in Jerusalem, to celebrate the festival. And then the tradition teaches us about two minor festivals. And one of those festivals is Purim, and the second of those festivals is Hanukkah. Hanukkah is actually the later of those two incidences in Jewish history. Purim is the commemoration of the physical survival of the Jewish people. It tells the story of the book of Esther, which is the first reported attempt of genocide in our people's history, where King Ahasuerus and his terrible servant, who is not to be named, Haman, decide that because the Jews are unwilling to follow the dictates, that they are to all be exterminated on the 13th day of Adar. And so because it celebrates the physical survival of the Jewish people, so we celebrate with a very physical celebration. We don masks and we get dressed up in costume and we avail ourselves of a lot of alcohol. And we do all these things so that we can celebrate the physical survival with our physicality. Hanukkah tells a different story. In the year 168 BCE, King Antiochus IV of Assyria, a Hellenistic king, made his way to Egypt to conduct a battle. And on his way home, he stopped off in the land of Judah and conquered it in the name of Hellenism and decided to create a vassal state where he didn't threaten the Jewish people physically, only if they would refuse to adopt Greek culture. Only if they would refuse to give up their religious traditions, their spiritual heritage, and embrace the traditions and the philosophy of the Greek gods and the Greek pantheon. And so, because Hanukkah is a celebration, certainly of a military victory of the Maccabees, but also is the celebration of the spiritual survival of the Jewish people, so Hanukkah is celebrated in a deeply spiritual fashion. There is an 8-day celebration, much like the celebration of Sukkot, on which Hanukkah, the rededication of the temple, was modeled. And so it is celebrated with light and it is celebrated with joy. And tonight we're going to take a look at some of the ways in which the Kabbalists, Jewish mystics over time, have looked at the celebration of Hanukkah and drawn deeper meanings from that celebration. Hanukkah, as we know, is celebrated at the darkest time of the year. And if you look outside, of course, it is already dark at 7 p.m. here in Boca Raton or wherever you may be. And that darkness wasn't just seen as a representation of a dark time of year near the winter solstice. It was also in many ways symbolic of the primordial elements of creation. When we look in the very first words of the Torah, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created the heavens and the earth. V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu. The world was all mixed up and messed up, was welter and waste. V'choshech al panei tahom, and there was darkness over the surface of the deep. So darkness itself was seen by the mystics to be even before the existence of creation. Isaac Luria, the Kabbalists of the 16th century in Sfat, posited the idea that actually at the beginning of time, God's presence inhabited all space in the universe, that the entire universe glowed from one end to the other with light, God's presence being the light, that primordial light in the universe. And then he said that in order for the world to come into being, God had to perform an act called tzimtzum. It had to be a contraction where God would decline from the space of the universe that God had inhabited in order to make a vacuum, a darkness into which the world could be born. And so when the Torah tells us that v'choshech al panei tahom, and there was darkness over the surface of the deep, it wasn't that darkness was there before light, but that because of the withdrawal of God's light from the universe, that part of the universe into which the world was born, so the world at the beginning was dark, but then God realized that light needed to return to the world. And so God created light. The very first thing that God creates is light. And so there is this paradigm and this paradox of our existence, which teaches in many ways that there is this element of darkness, that in many ways preceding the world was darkness, and that it is in many ways the mission of the Holy One, and then using humanity as partners in creation to restore that light into the darkened part of the universe that God had to fashion in order for there to be space, primordial space for the world to come into being. And so when we think about Hanukkah as the festival of light, in many ways, it is the celebration of the birth of the world, not in the way that we celebrate on Rosh Hashanah, but this idea of the celebration of light itself. This idea of how is it that we invite God into the darkness? How is it that we are able to bring a sense of God's presence into the places where God is not? Because if we believe, as Luria did, that in order for the world to come into being, God had to make room in order to have room for the world, that meant that there had to be a place where God was not, then there had to then be a way for God to return. And that is in many ways, I think, the paradox of our spiritual lives, that in many ways, God is everywhere, God is all around, and yet, and there are times when it feels like God is absent. We have to lead our physical lives. We have to live in this physical world, and we posit the idea as Jews that God transcends physicality, that God is that thing in the universe that is no thing, that God is that force in the universe that you can't see and touch. And so as we bring God's presence into the universe, and as we consider that, we think about what it actually is to consider a flame, to consider one piece of primordial light. And as we consider that piece of primordial light, I want us for a moment to just take a look at your screen, and you will see on your screen the image of a flame. Now, we may see flames all the time. Certainly during these nights of Hanukkah, we've seen lots of flames dancing on the wicks of our candles and our Chanukiot and our Hanukkah menorahs. But I want us just to take 30 seconds or so, and let's meditate on this image of this flame. I want you to focus, if you can, on the component parts of the flame that you see, that which gives it its birth, that which gives it its form, its shape, that which creates for its essence, and the parts that you experience even beyond that sense of sight itself. Let's just take a moment, if we can, and just in a little bit of silence, reflect on the image of this one piece of light. So this first text that I'm going to invite us to consider tonight comes from the work of Moshe de Leon. Moshe de Leon lived in the 14th century, 13th century in the Provence, in northern Spain, southern France, and he is considered to be the author of the greatest work of Jewish mystical literature, the Zohar. If you ask traditional Jews, they'll tell you that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great sage of the Mishnah, was the author, because Moshe de Leon participated in his authorship in a piece of pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is a fun word which you can use to impress your friends. It means when you ascribe authorship of something that you authored to someone else. So Moshe de Leon was afraid that if he said, oh, this is a piece of mystical literature that I authored, that no one would take him seriously. And so he pretended that he had found this lost manuscript from the 2nd century from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that from that time, and from Yitzchak. And so he found this text, and so he retrojected it onto the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And he is the primordial author, the premier author, but wasn't really the author. But that's just how Moshe de Leon wrote the text. We know that he wrote the text and not from the 1st century of the rabbinic period, because there are pieces in his Aramaic that actually have Spanish words, and because they found a letter from Moshe de Leon's wife who said, Moshe, you worked so hard on this thing, you should take credit for it. In any case, Moshe de Leon also wrote an earlier work called Shekel HaKodesh, the holy coin, and he writes this idea. He says, the essence of faith and the root of the holy intention for a human being in this world is to serve his creator, to repair his soul, and in the words of the book of Job, to be enlightened with the light of the living. So if we posit the idea that humanity is created in God's image, then if God is light, then there is a spark of light that is implanted within us that makes us who we are, that is in many ways our soul. And so the essence of faith, the root of what a human being is supposed to be in this world, is to be a servant of the Creator, to repair your soul in order that you can be enlightened with the light of the living, that you can nurture this inner flame that dwells within, that God implanted within you at the very first moment of your existence. And so Moshe de Leon teaches, and delve deeply, look deeper, because the secret of faith and the root of intention is that a person in this world be a foundation, a seat upon which may rest the throne on high. So if we posit the idea that God is a king, the Melech HaMelchei Melachim, the king of kings, we speak of God in this way on the high holidays when we sing Avinu Malkeinu, our God, our ruler. So he imagines in a mystical fashion that God rests on a throne. And so how is it that God can rest on a throne? What is our role? Is to support that throne. The secret of faith, the root of intention, is that a person in this world is the foundation and seat upon which that throne may rest. That person is the wick. And the mitzvot and the good deeds are the oil to prepare the wick and to provide the oil on the head of the wick, so that the radiant light will shine on her, so that she will be illumined before her Creator. So if we take a look at this image of the flame that we have here, here we have the wick and the oil that feeds the wick, right? And so a person is the wick. We are this wick. The commandments, the mitzvahs that we are asked to do are the oil that, because of our holy intention, is drawn into the wick and covers us. So whenever we do a mitzvah, whenever we do something that is in accordance with God's teachings, when we embrace another facet of that Ol HaTorah, the yoke of Torah, the obligation to lead a holy life, when we perform one of those sacred and holy acts, no matter what it is, it could be lighting Shabbat candles, it could be making Kiddush on a holiday, it could be lighting Hanukkah candles, it could be any of the mitzvot we're asked to follow. we draw some of that oil, some of God's essence into ourselves so that the radiant light will shine on us and that there will be illumination before God. And this is what the Master of Secrets said. May your clothes always be white and no lack of oil on your head, from the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, so that this light of which we spoke will shine upon her and her candle will not go out by night. The essence of the mitzvot and good deeds that a person does in this world is to prepare his soul and to repair great and good matters above and draw forth upon him the abundant light from above. And so it is really, what is the fuel that allows our light to remain kindled on the inside? What allows us to be the wick so that the light of God's presence can shine from within us and therefore shine upon that throne on high? It is the performance of those holy deeds. It is the work of Torah. So often we say to ourselves, how do I become a spiritual person? How do I embrace spirituality? Do I need to go sit under a lotus tree? No, the path in Jewish tradition that teaches us to find that sense of spiritual fulfillment is actually the performance of Jewish deeds, the performance of the mitzvot. Now, sometimes we feel like, I don't understand why I perform the mitzvot. I don't understand how they work. I feel like sometimes I do it by rote. In some ways, that's true, which is why we learn, so that we can have a better appreciation for what the mitzvot ask us to do. But in many ways, it sometimes can be just those simple mitzvot. We don't have to recreate the wheel. Torah has been given to us as a tremendous gift from generation to generation, and so that we might learn and do, so that we can be those lights that shine upon God's presence, that illumine that holy world in which God dwells. In mystical tradition, the way that we illumine the world is through a ladder that links us from God's world to our world. And this ladder is called the Enneagram or the Sphirot. The Sphirot are the 10 emanations of God's presence that come down from on high, down into our world here. Some of you may have seen this diagram before. And we're going to spend a little time with this diagram tonight to try to understand a little bit of the ways in which God's presence is to be found. And so at the top, at the beginning, you have what's called Ein Sof, the boundless. So remember, we talked about how God used to extend from one end of the universe to the other, right? God was boundless. God has no limitations. God has nothing that bounds God or binds God or restricts God. God inhabits all space and everything. And so that unlimitedness of what God is was then limited so that God could exist in the world. The first of that is called Keter, which means crown. The first limiting of God's presence to say, I'm going to channel, almost in the way that you have the vast ocean, which is then channeled into an inlet, the Zohar teaches. And then, almost as if water coming through a ladder, the light returns from Ein Sof through these Sphirot, through these vessels, into our world through a pattern. From Keter, it goes into the Sphira of wisdom, of Chokhmah. And from that to Bina, to understanding. And these first three emanations, these first three vessels, these first three of the Sphirot are considered to be a bit different than the lower seven. The link between Chokhmah, wisdom, and Bina, which is understanding, in this middle space is referred to as Da'at, knowledge or awareness. And if you think about what it means to be aware, what it means to have awareness, what it means to be fully present, it is that balance, that connective tissue between our understanding, our knowledge, and our wisdom. Think about those moments when you were in pure awareness, when you were fully aware, fully present in a particular moment, not lost in thought, not somewhere far away, but fully present in a time when you were fully aware and concentrating on what your immediacy of your experience was. That was in many ways that connective tissue between wisdom and understanding. And then the Sphirot descend into these lower sefirot into chesed and gevura. Chesed is compassion, gevura is strength. Sometimes this is called din, or strict justice. And then the mediating influence of tiferet, of beauty. Then into netzach, which is sometimes translated as endurance, which nitzachon means victory. This is our drive. This is the part that compels us forward to advance, to achieve. And then you have hod, which is majesty or awe or wonder. And then it links into the yesod. There's a lot of erotic imagery in Jewish mysticism. Yesod is often thought of as the phallus. And then malchut, which is sometimes called kingdom, or Shekinah, the indwelling presence of God. This is the element of God's presence that we sometimes feel in our own lives. When you feel like, oh, I had a sense that God was near. I had a sense of presence, that God was there with me. I had a holy moment. I had a transcendent experience. That is that sense of connection to that lowest element, to the Shekinah, to the way in which God dwells within us. And so it is through this ladder that we seek to try to restore some sense of light to the world. We are to ask, as agents of the Holy One, to restore Malchut, the Shekinah, God's presence, to Tiferet. Shekinah being the feminine presence, Tiferet being the masculine presence, and to unite those two together in order to achieve that complete sense of unity and oneness that is sometimes hard to find in the world. The mystics took a look at this and said the menorah from the temple often reflects this very diagram, this very sense. And if you take a look at the menorah, not the menorah that we use for Hanukkah, the 7-branch menorah that stood in the temple, you have in the middle keter, okay, that crown, right? And then you have the side, right, the pillar of mercy and the pillar of judgment on the left. You have the mediating, right, elements here in the middle, but you have, just like you had before, chokhmah and bina, and then chesed and gevura, and then nitzach, and then hod. But uniting those, right, in the middle are da'at, awareness, like we talked about, tiferet, beauty, right, the mediating influence here between chesed and gevura, and then yesod, right, the foundation between netzach and hod, between that drive and awe and wonder, and that balance. And that all leads into the base, that which holds the lamp, that which holds that holy light that's shown in the temple precinct, inside the tent of meeting, in the tabernacle, in the wilderness, is that sense of God's presence, which the tabernacle itself represents, that idea of God dwelling within us. When God asks us to build a tabernacle, God says, "Shuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham." Make for me a mikdash, make for me a holy place, and I will dwell within you, right? I will dwell in your midst, that malchut, that sense of God's presence that dwells among us. And the Zohar, that fast work that is the mystical commentary in the Torah that Moshe de Leon created, ascribing to Shimon Bar Yochai, teaches the following. He says, certainly the vessel of the Holy One, the Shekinah, because she is associated with the Sephira of Malchut, that lowest one, in which the ruling hand of God is revealed in the world of action, she is the vessel, that's why it's referred to Shekinah, this feminine form, is the vessel that serves her master. So follow this idea of God's presence. This is so powerful. The Shekinah is God's menorah. God's presence in our world is a menorah. Why? Because it is the lampstand. It is the vessel of light that we bring into our sacred spaces. The Shekinah, when we encounter God, imagine that you are encountering a menorah. As it says in the book of Psalms, 7 times a day I praise you because of your righteous judgments. What are the 7? Those 7 lower sephirot. God is represented by the 7th spirit of Zer Anpin. Zer Anpin is a mystical image that is related to those 7 lower sephirot. What are those 7 lower sephirot? Right? We're talking about these. Gevura and Chesed, Tiferet, Hod, Netzach, Yesod, and Malchut or Shekinah in this part, right? So what are these lower ones? So remember, we had the Tzavada, we have the upper ones, right? And Bina is considered the mother of these lower seven, that it's through the mate of Chokhmah and Bina, through that da'at, that holy awareness of wisdom and understanding, that we have birth to compassion and strength and justice, to tranquility and beauty, to drive and endurance, to majesty and awe and wonder, and to the sense of God's presence that is rooted in our universe and rooted in ourselves. And so they say God is represented here, and those are those seven lamps. There is likened to the lights on the top of the menorah. Malchut is likened to the day that contains seven different ways of praise, and to the menorah that is the base for seven lights. The Hebrew word for praise, Hallel, which we also recite on Hanukkah, as we do on the other major festivals, is understood here to refer to light, as in the verse from the book of Job, when the light, in Hebrew, hilo, if his candle shone on my head. And if you take a look at the similar to English word halo, right, hilo, this light, right, that shone on his head, it was translated as halo in English, as we think of like a halo from a Christian image of an angel. These seven sfirot of Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, and Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut are the seven because of these seven levels. And so the menorah itself, in many ways, was seen to be representative of God's presence, that the menorah is the way in which we bring light into the world. So when we kindle our Chanukiot and we light the menorah, it's not just to have pretty candles. It's the way of saying we are kindling a sense of God's light in the darkened universe. This is the reminder that we are to be agents of light to help bring that sense of God's presence to be experienced for those who sit in darkness, for those who are unaware of the presence of God in their lives. And so, as we think about how the menorah is in many ways a manifestation of that set of the sfirot, of all of those different emanations of God's presence, we're reminded that the Shekinah, the presence of God that we experience itself, is like a menorah. It's a way of bringing that light of God's presence into our world. Now, looking again at the candle, the Zohar reflects on what is the soul. Now, oftentimes we think about the soul, right, as being the opposite part of our physicality, that we have our physical selves, right, our bodies, and then there's our spiritual selves that we call our souls. But the Zohar asks us to think about, well, what is the soul? And provides this meditation on what the soul itself is. And he says there are actually three words in Hebrew for soul. The first word is nefesh. Nefesh, this word for soul, is lower arousal, supporting the body, nourishing it. And so if we remember that there is this wick, that there is this flame, right? So they're going to take a look at the flame as a metaphor for the soul itself. The body fastens on her. She is fastened to the body. Okay, so our souls in many ways are fastened inside our bodies.